Screen.
Yes.
Cool. So we were Team F, aka the EcoGeoMath Marmot Alliance, or EGMA, which gazoon tight. And there's our mascot, AI generated. And I really enjoyed our team. We had in the upper left Tate, who's an applied math PhD student, Allison, who was one of our mentors at ESOL, Taylor, another mentor at ESOL, Nyani, who's an environmental scientist, me, who was in applied math and am now in biotech in industry, and Kelly, who's an environmental scientist, and Bill, who's a K through 12 educator. So a lot of different backgrounds, but it was fun to work with everyone. So our first project had to do with biodiversity, which I'm sure people here are suspect of whether it matters. So I'll tell you why it matters. So the health and character of ecosystems depends on ecosystem biodiversity. And so the ability to assess and estimate biodiversity is critical to monitoring the health and changes to ecosystems, especially as climate change exacerbates those. And there are many ways to measure biodiversity. High quality data from sources like the National Ecological Observatory Network and comprehensive surveys. Those high quality sets are resource intensive to gather and only available in limited geographic areas. Estimates of plant diversity, biodiversity can be derived from remote sensing data and citizen science data, both of which are more readily accessible and less intensive to gather, at least for the non-citizens who are not doing the hiking. But the problem with the more readily available data sets is that it's unclear how to compare their estimates of biodiversity that come from them. Yeah, pass it over to Tate.
Yeah, in this project, we are using a variety of data sets. In terms of, we use citizen science data like the Global Biodiversity Network, GBIF, and iNaturalist data. And also we will use some of the distributed network data like NEON that has like standard data collection protocols. And also we use global wall-to-wall data sets like the Landsat data. In terms of geospatial data sets, if we talk about in geospatial terms, we use the vector and both raster and vector data sets. For example, in the vector data sets, we use the point data, the species occurrence from the GBIF data, and the line data sets like the OpenStreetMaps, and also the polygon data sets from the fire data. Those are fire polygons delineated from the MODIS data sets. And also we use the raster data sets from Landsat data. To the next slide.
Yeah, and so we pulled together a bunch of these data sets. So the outlines in both of these are from the fire data, and it's showing a burn region. This is the Rim Fire in California that I believe overlaps with Yosemite Park. And so here we have some remotely sensed kind of diversity statistics, I believe from reflectance data from Landsat. And then on the other side, we have a very different character of data. Here we have, once again, the fire polygon is in blue, but we've also added in the OpenStreetMap data that's showing roads and trails. And here we also overlaid the GBIF data. And these are, I believe, professional grade iNaturalist observations. And I think it's mostly of plants. So I can't remember if we filtered by that. So you can see that there's a really strong correlation where citizen science is happening close to populated areas, near trails and along roads.
So we had several different things we were interested in. One of which was, what are the relationships between different and possibly biased or incomplete measures of biodiversity? And I want to go quick through this slide because we kind of moved away from the equation that's here. But one of our ideas at first was to see if we could predict some kind of measure of improved diversity from remote sense diversity and citizen science diversity and some other predictors. But we realized that there's probably not much overlap between remote sense citizen science and whatever we would use for improved diversity. So we abandoned that. But one thing, while working on that, we looked at was this plot in the bottom right, which shows that the diversity metrics from citizen science data depend on the number of observations, right? Like if no one goes to an area, no one will see any species. And so one of the ideas that we also had was to maybe do some kind of Bayesian modeling that would show that our estimate of diversity was a function of the number of observations, like the uncertainty and diversity would increase as the number of observations decreased. So, yeah.
Yeah, and one way we were thinking we could maybe capture some of these correlations is clustering or some unsupervised learning, for example, through an encoder-decoder network. The idea would be to somehow rasterize metrics like your distance to the nearest road and some sort of turn your point clouds into a rasterized density function, and then predict off of that, try to force the data through an information bottleneck and see if you're able to get any sort of useful correlations between the data then, because, for example, we've already seen that citizen kind of science is happening near roads. Can we kind of undo that correlation to extrapolate outward to areas that maybe don't have as much citizen science happening?
So as we've mentioned, we had two different ways of measuring biodiversity, looking at these citizen science data as well as remotely sensed estimates of biodiversity. And one thing we were interested in looking at is how these different estimates respond to the impact of a natural disaster like a fire, because we'd expect them to respond differently. It's also very important to estimate these impacts in order to understand how biodiversity recovers after these disasters. Next slide, please. So we looked at a case study, again, Tate mentioned it, but we looked at the Rim Fire in California, and we found differences in both remotely sensed biodiversity estimates as well as the citizen science data. We found a decrease after the fire in the total number of, or in the biodiversity estimates. However, next slide, please. When you put them onto the same plot, you can see that there's dramatically different scales of these impacts based on the fire. So the citizen science data, again, as Eric mentioned, is highly variable and responsive to the total number of observations that are occurring in terms of biodiversity estimates, whereas the remote sensing data are much less variable. Naomi, did you want to describe a little bit about the remote sensing data and how you analyze that?
Yes. So the remote sensing is like obtaining information about an object from distance. So in this case, we use Landsat satellite data as our data source. And because like the Landsat data provides the longest record of Earth observations. And in this data set, like the one sample covers like about a 30 by 30 meter area on the ground. The properties of that little 30 by 30 meter area on the ground is defined by the set of reflectance in response to the solar radiation that ground sample received. So as different objects on the ground interacts differently with the solar radiation, like the type of the vegetation, the soil type, or the rocks, we can assume that the reflectance profiles in each pixel can tell us about the type and the abundance of the objects within that little pixel. So if we can consider that little pixel as one individual or set of individuals, then we can use those variations in the reflectance across the neighborhood and the landscape to tell that how similar or different they are. So this is what we have done here. Like our remotely sensed diversity is described how each different pixels are varies across to their neighborhood and also across the landscape.
Awesome. So next slide, please. So in addition to the rim fire, we also studied a more recent fire because we thought that potentially more recently there would be a greater number of iNaturalist observations since it has become far more popular through time. So again, we see an interesting trend. We see that same trend, very small, of higher variability in the citizen science data, but still there is a dip in the diversity measurements after the fire in both data sets. So understanding how these data sets co-vary together could help us to get a better idea of the true impact of these fires on biodiversity, which is inherently unknowable. So I'll pass it back to Nayani for the final conclusions.
Yeah, thank you, Kelly. And so all of these analysis that we can bring into three main points in terms of the broader impacts. So critical science is critically important aspect. And then so with this improved analysis, we can tell like how we can inform the citizen science, and also can tell like how these improvements can help understand that the diversity. And also like this will help us to know or better understand like how we could interpret the citizen science diversity versus the remote citizen diversity. And in the overall, like the biodiversity change is one of the biggest things happening through the climate and human impacts. With this information derived from the citizen science, and also that wall-to-wall data sets that we get from the satellite data, we can tell like how the ecosystem resilience and recovery varies across the globe through this varying climate and human impacts. I think that's all. The next slide. Now this is our team, and thank you, everybody.
Wow, thank you. This is really pushing the boundaries of data use. Citizen science and satellites. This is extremely exciting. Thank you for this. We have 5 minutes for questions.
Could you stop sharing so that we could see you while I ask you questions?
Yep.
All right, it looks like I'm first. Thank you for a great presentation. I really love projects that like seriously grapple with the limitations of the data sources. So I love that about this. You mentioned the possibility of starting with data close to roads because the observations from citizen science are more frequent there. I wonder what your thoughts are about potentially looking at entirely different regions where citizen science observations are denser, potentially like building a model, somewhere where there's a higher population density and then extrapolating it to more remote areas. Just if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think that I can speak a little to that. I think that the hope is to somehow create a layer in our data cube that measures distance to roads as a proxy for kind of how close you are to civilization or population centers. And then if you can train a model on that, hopefully it will realize the correlation, and maybe you can correct for the bias based on just kind of where people are sampling the data. I don't know if that answers the question, but that's kind of the drift we're going for.
Yeah, thank you.
You want to go, Bruno? You're in the top left for me.
Yeah, so I had 2 questions. One of them, if I may, I'm not gonna, I'm just rambling now. Anyway, so the iNaturalist portion of that, do you have any plan of how to get more people to actually develop more occurrence in the area so you can have better models for the regions that you don't have a lot of occurrence points? And my other question is more related to the index that you are using as diversity measure. Channel index has a lot of influence of richness and abundance. At the same time, you don't really know what's important there. And I wonder if it is the same thing when you measure based on an occurrence of species and when you remote sense the data, if they're very different just because they are measuring drastically different things, and maybe you can use a better index of diversity in the remote and the iNaturalist data sets.
Was the first question how to get more people to take pictures elsewhere? I don't know if we thought about that. I mean, we could try putting cake around the country in different places. But yeah, that's just a joke. But in terms of measuring different things, I'll probably defer to the environmental scientists. But another thing we thought about doing is, regardless of whatever the diversity metric is, we could fit a model that mapped citizen science data to whatever the metric is, to whatever the metric of on the remote sense data is, and yeah, just predict one from the other if we wanted to understand how predictable one of the metrics is from the other. Does anyone else want to take a stab?
Yeah, maybe I think the idea is, like you were saying, just the density of citizen science may have a slight correlation with kind of what's interesting out there. If there's a diversity of species, people are more likely maybe to take more photos of different things. The hard part is disentangling that from confounding factors.
As far as your question to the diversity, I think Kelly would be able to talk to that more, but unfortunately she had a meeting at 11, so had to hop off. But I'm sure if you follow up with her, she'll have some good answers.
Nick, do you want to?
Yeah, so actually I had a sort of similar question to Bruno, but and maybe my question is like throwing the baby out with the bathwater, but it feels like all of the indices are relatively limited, right? Like all those univariate approaches can be super weak to the sort of algebra that goes into those single values. Have you considered a multivariate species composition or functional group approach to try and make those data sets a little bit more comparable before trying to sort of figure out what their real differences are?
Yeah, are you saying take each species as a layer and use its observations and kind of estimate the density for that single species?
Yeah, or
definitely
recognizing that might be a big ask, especially for the remotely sensed, a functional group approach, because I bet you could get like legumes and stuff into a category.
That's an interesting idea. I think it would really depend on kind of what are are there enough observations of one species that you can actually get a good estimate of a density function.
Lori?
Yeah, thank you for the presentation. I agree with Claire that it's really cool to see you grappling with what can we really draw from these data sets and how comparable are they. I was wondering if you could close the loop for me a little bit with one of your conclusions. I'm trying to think about how this would change people's behavior. There was a question about, or a statement about, this would improve citizen science activities. And I was trying to think about how this would actually translate into a change in the behavior of a citizen contributing to one of these data sets.
One of the things that I think about there is maybe less affecting citizens, like their behavior, and more affecting how we interpret that data. Yeah, that's one thing. Nayani, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I think like I see like lots of uncertainty in some of the areas where the citizen science data is we don't have much citizen science data, but we have lots of remote sensing data. We can inform each other to say like, okay, we need more information on these areas and we don't have information. And then if people get to know more about like what's happening in that area, then we can get more involved from those citizens who are interested in helping and better understanding what's going on. I believe like most of the citizen data come from citizens who are very interested in the ecological processes. And so we can inform them more and then get to involve them more. So if they see that how their data will be used to inform more about the nature, and the processes in the nature.
Yeah, I didn't really think about this, but yeah, you can use it as a tool to say, hey, iNaturalists, people who use this, you're not collecting data here. Maybe go check it out. We don't have any observations. That'd be cool.
Don't see any other hands.
And
Okay.
we're running out of time. So quite perfect.